hard and fast deadline, so maybe if we could start off with you, sir.
Thank you very much, Governor. I appreciate your accommodating me. Is this working? I'm delighted to be here this morning and honored to be asked to share some of my views with you. I think the primary benefit that I might be able to offer the committee, which is something less than the expertise of the witnesses you've just heard, is that for the last year and a half, I traveled this country trying to get a grip on all of the questions you've been dealing with, and in particular the questions you were dealing with this morning. And I spoke at great length not only to the people at the top of the issues, Attorney General Ashcroft, Secretary Ridge, Bob Bonner, Jim Loy, and people like that and their staffs, but also to the people who are actually out in the field trying to implement and make sense of what was going on in Washington during some very difficult times. And my goal was to make a connection between policy, between discussions like the ones we're having today, and what was actually happening in the airports, at the docks, at the borders. And what I found, I think I can keep my remarks fairly brief and I hope quite simple, really falls much more under the category of what we can do going forward as opposed to mistakes we might have made in the past. But I did come across some of those mistakes that we made in the past. First, one general observation that I suspect that everyone in this room shares and that I really got to see firsthand in I think, a very special way. The people out there doing this job are, I think, the worthy successors to the greatest generation that Tom Brokaw wrote about. There are people in customs, in INS, in the Coast Guard, obviously men and women overseas who have really risen to the challenges of what I call the September 12th era. And the issue is what kind of support those people are going to get. Their dedication is constant. Their attention spans are long. I sat in on meetings of people who have been dealing with the cargo container security issue, who've been dealing with this issue for 10 or 11 or 12 years or 20 years. I sat in on meetings where the Office of Homeland Security brought people together for the first time from the Department of Transportation, from Customs, the Coast Guard, the Treasury, the Department of State to deal with a problem like container security or deal with a problem like the borders. And they were delighted to meet each other. They'd all been working off in their corners in different places, dedicated to these issues. Their attention span is long. I can't say the same, with all respect, to many of you on this panel, for members of the Congress, for members of the executive branch, and certainly for members of the press. Their attention spans are quite something else. First, let me just recount a couple of the obvious pre-9/11 mistakes that I encountered. One was that on the evening of September 11th, airline executives started to get a fax from the FAA. And the FAA's fax was, guess what? A watch list, a no-fly list. Don't let these 300 people fly. This is the evening of September 11th. And airline executives had the same reaction that I suspect you have, which is, it's too bad we didn't get this the morning of September the 11th. There were 300 names on that list. That list had been sitting around. It had been provided both by the CIA and the FBI to the head of civil security at the FAA, and they hadn't yet developed over a period of months a protocol for how to add names or subtract names from the list and under whose letterhead the list was going to be issued, so they hadn't issued it. Evening of September 11th, they decided to issue it. The second story that I think illustrates the lack of urgency. On the northern border, this is something that Inspector General Fine has reported on, more times than you're ever going to have hearings. On the northern border, there were two Border Patrol agents who in 1999 testified before Congress about something called the Catch and Release Program. Here's what the Catch and Release Program is. They would catch people sneaking over the border in Detroit, walking through the train tunnel or coming in on little boats on the shore. They'd catch them, and then what they would do is they would give them a self-addressed postcard, and they'd hand them a postcard after they caught them and arrested them, and they'd hand them this card and they'd say, listen, when you get an address in the United States, the country you were sneaking into that you're not supposed to be in, when you establish an address here, send us back this postcard because then we'll know your address. Then we can mail you a notice of your deportation hearing. And then you can come for a hearing and then we can deport you. And, you know, a lot of these people didn't really show up for the deportation hearing or send the postcards back. They testified about that in 1999. What happens in October of 2001? I'm sorry, not October, the week after September 11th, 2001. They tell a reporter for the Detroit Free Press something less than what I've just told you. Much less in detail, that the northern border isn't secure, that we don't have the resources, we can't hold people in detention when we catch them. And guess what happens to them? They get a notice that they're going to be fired. And luckily, the Inspector General stepped in, the Office I think it's the Special Counsel's Office that protects whistleblowers stepped in. They did not get fired, but that was the INS Border Patrol reaction. That policy, after there was yet another hearing in November of 2001, that policy has now been changed somewhat. But this took September 11th. It took an Inspector General. It took some reports in the Detroit Free Press before that policy, which, you know, talk about obvious gaps, you know, such as the general aviation gap. This is a fairly obvious gap. One more example. Just before the millennium, there was a very well-publicized arrest of someone who was attempting to sneak in over the northern border in Washington State, who had plans to blow up Los Angeles Airport. Ray Kelly, who was then the customs director, thought that as a result of that, this was a good time to reinforce the northern border with as many customs agents as he could possibly send there. And his attitude, as I recount in the book, was, I'll send them there, and surely Congress will pay for it now that we've made this arrest of this guy who's going to blow up Los Angeles Airport. Surely the issue of what the budget is going to be to protect the northern border is going to be solved by this obvious manifestation of the crisis. And those extra agents lasted for a few months. Congress lost interest, and it went back to being just the way it was. The air marshals, just one more point, on September 11th, the air marshals, there were 31 U.S. air marshals in the United States of America, none of them on a single airplane on the morning of September 11th. Their target is something upwards of 3,000, I think, now. And we're doing it urgently, and I guess that's good. But today, as we speak, the attention span is still mixed. It still takes the INS, they say, 5 to 7 months to render an environmental impact statement before they can put a pole up that will hold a camera at a strategic point in the northern border, or to put motion detectors. They have to do environmental impact statements. 5 to 7 months in an administration that is not otherwise really quite that well known for its sensitivity to the environment. Now, the dilemma of all this is I could sit here for 2 or 3 hours, as could the other members of this panel, and talk about the gaps. The really serious issue is that we can never really be doing enough. We can all trade anecdotes, and we can all decide that we're not doing enough, and you really can't do enough in a country that has 7,500 miles of border, that has thousands of miles of natural gas pipelines, tens of thousands of facilities storing or shipping dangerous chemicals, infinite entrances to subways, to trains, to office buildings, and just as many vulnerabilities related to the food or water supply, or even to office building ventilation systems. So the critics that we're not doing enough are always going to be right. The issue is, how can we make the debate and the way we go forward a little more constructive than that? There's never going to be enough money to solve everything. And I think the opportunity that this commission has, that some independent, nonpartisan body can have, whether it's the GAO or a commission like this that goes forward, that goes on, is that it can set specific, tangible standards for improvement in homeland security. It can set up, to give you an example, it can declare that if we have our undercover people who work for a commission like this try to sneak something into the port, it should be detected by customs, by Homeland Security, 99.6% of the time, and let's give the American people a report every quarter or every half year of how we're doing. Let's set goals. We can target these things and we can set goals. We can't do everything. The debate we have today is really one where it's easy to be partisan. It's really easy because you can always say if there's a terror attack, and there is going to be another terror attack. And when there is, whether it's in the subways or whether it's general aviation or whether it's the ports, there'll always be a way to point and say that somebody screwed up. For example, Customs has initiated a very intelligent program in risk management called the Customs Partnership. And what they do is they pre-screen the truck drivers who drive the most over the Ambassador Bridge in Detroit. They're screened in advance, and because they're screened, they get something that gets them on a fast line. That's really intelligent. We could all sit here and say that's intelligent. The test for this country, the test for the dialogue we're all going to have is that if, God forbid, one of the people who's gone through that screening does something terrible, are we going to have all kinds of recriminations and say we should stop every truck? That was a stupid plan. How could we have done it? Or are we going to say, well, we started a system. The system still makes sense. It didn't work in this case. That doesn't mean we scrap the system and go back to what we were doing at the airports on September 12th, which is checking everybody, no matter who they were or what they were. The point I'm really trying to make is that we have to think about intelligent risk management. The most important place we have to think about it is in the private sector, or certainly not the federal sector. There are 1,750 checkpoints at all the airports in the United States of America combined, 1,750. There are approximately 1,760 entrances to the New York City subway system. Now, we all agree the TSA is doing a great job. So for only $6 billion and 45,000 new employees, we could protect the New York City subway system the way we're protecting the airports. Now, for those of us who ride the subway, that sounds like a pretty good idea, but we can't do that. And by the way, when we decide to do that, then we have to deal with the 17,000 entrances to office buildings in in Manhattan. And when we get through there, we probably want to start thinking about Chicago and San Francisco and Los Angeles and every place else. We can't simply throw that kind of money at the problem. We have to get the private sector involved. I think we have to have something on the order of a voluntary identity card that that companies in the private sector could issue to people that screens them voluntarily, so that when we have lines, as we're going to have in office buildings and in subway stations and in train terminals, we're going to have those lines after the next attack. When we do that, we're managing the risk a little more rationally. But the one thought I really want to leave you with is that I think that the best thing a commission like this can do is either suggest or else go and do it itself, setting specific goals in all the areas you're talking about. And then instead of the Democrats criticizing the Republicans for not spending enough money here, and the Republicans saying, yeah, but we've reorganized the government and we now have this department, so obviously we're doing enough, and we hold a press conference to say we're spending this much money here. That is not a constructive debate. You can quantify this. You can manage this the way people in the private sector manage lots of problems by setting specific goals, specific timetables, and having a nonpartisan body report on how we're doing. I thank you.